7 years ago, a young woman in Bardstown, Kentucky vanished after finishing her shift at a bourbon distillery, leaving behind a tight-knit community desperate for answers and a family torn apart by uncertainty. The police examined every possibility from tragic accidents to abduction, but without a body or solid evidence, the case went cold, trapping detectives in a maze of dead ends and unanswered questions. Yet through all those years, her younger sister and heartbroken parents refused to give up, holding on to the belief that someone, somewhere, knew what happened that October night. Then a single anonymous message broke 7 years of silence, revealing a truth so devastating it would shatter everything this small Kentucky town believed about trust, grief, and the man who had stood beside them, searching for answers all along. Before diving into this story, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is at your location. And don't forget to hit subscribe to keep following along with us. In October 2013, Bardstown's autumn air carried the sweet scent of aging bourbon from nearby distilleries, the town bathed in golden hues of falling leaves. Known as the bourbon capital of the world, this community of roughly 13,000 souls prided itself on Southern hospitality and the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's grandparents and Sunday church services drew half the town. Life moved at a slower pace here, where Friday night football games and bourbon heritage festivals defined the rhythm of the year. On the evening of October 11th, that sense of safety was destroyed forever. Natalie Grace Hammond, 28 years old, finished her evening shift as a tour coordinator at Heaven Hill Distillery, one of Bardstown's most beloved bourbon landmarks. Her colleagues waved goodbye as she walked through the visitor center's glass doors toward the employee parking lot where her silver Honda Civic waited under the dim glow of security lights. With a tired smile, Natalie climbed into her car, pulled out her phone to text her fiancé, and drove into Bardstown's quiet streets. But from that moment, no one saw her return. Her fiancé, Ryan Caldwell, 31, waited at the small Cape Cod house they rented on 3rd Street, just blocks from the historic courthouse square. He'd prepared dinner, set the table, and checked his phone repeatedly as minutes turned to hours. By 9:30, when Natalie's phone went straight to voicemail for the 5th time, worry twisted into panic. At 10:15, Ryan called the Bardstown Police Department, his voice shaking as he reported his fiancée missing. The woman who lit up every room with her infectious laugh, who'd grown up in this town attending summer festivals and Sunday Mass, had vanished without a trace. From that first night, a single question gripped not only the Hammond family, but the entire Bardstown community. Where did Natalie go? And what happened in those 15 minutes between leaving work and never arriving home? That same night Ryan reported her missing, Bardstown Police Department immediately dispatched patrol teams to Heaven Hill Distillery, combing the parking lot where Natalie was last seen and expanding the search to surrounding roads. Flashlights swept across the dark stretches of Highway 245, officers checking ditches and turnoffs for any sign of the silver Honda Civic. They patrolled the winding back roads Natalie might have taken home, searching slopes and hidden curves where a car could have veered off course. Meanwhile, some units circled the perimeter of Bernheim Arboretum and Research Forest, its dense Kentucky hardwoods swallowing the beam of their searchlights. But the night offered only silence and the rustling of autumn leaves against cold wind. Ryan stood in that parking lot with Detective Marcus Webb, a 20-year veteran of the Bardstown Police who'd known Natalie since she was a teenager, working summers at the local farmers market. His hands trembled as he pulled out his phone, showing the detective the last text message. "She sent this at 6:45, Ryan said, his voice breaking. "Said she was leaving work, would be home in 15 minutes. That was it. Nothing after that." Detective Webb's jaw tightened as he stared at those words on the screen. 15 minutes to drive 3 miles through town. Something had gone terribly wrong in those 15 minutes. Heaven Hill's security cameras became the first piece of evidence. The footage showed Natalie leaving the visitor center at 6:43, walking to her car with her purse slung over her shoulder, her auburn hair catching the parking lot lights. She climbed into the Honda, started the engine, and drove toward the exit. The timestamp read 6:46. But the cameras didn't cover the road beyond the distillery gates, and from there, she disappeared into the Kentucky night like smoke. Detective Webb immediately organized search protocols. Officers knocked on doors along every possible route between Heaven Hill and 3rd Street. Did anyone see a silver Honda? Did anyone hear anything unusual? The responses were all the same. Nothing. No one had seen Natalie's car. No one had heard screeching tires or witnessed an accident. It was as if she'd driven into thin air. By dawn, the reality set in. This wasn't a simple case of a broken-down car or a detour to visit a friend. Natalie's phone had gone dead or been turned off shortly after that final text. Her bank account showed no activity. Her credit cards hadn't been used. And most troubling of all, her car was nowhere to be found in a town small enough that a missing vehicle should have been spotted within hours. Detective Webb called in support from Kentucky State Police Post 4 in Elizabethtown. By Saturday morning, the search had expanded to include neighboring Nelson County areas, with officers checking every back road, every abandoned property, every place a car might have gone unnoticed. Helicopters from Louisville flew overhead, their rotors beating against the autumn sky as they scanned the landscape below. Dive teams were dispatched to check local bodies of water, Beach Fork River, and the various creeks cutting through the county's rolling hills. Each search turned up nothing. Ryan couldn't just wait at home. He drove the route himself a dozen times, stopping at every turn, every intersection, calling Natalie's name into the empty air. He checked the gas stations, the late-night diners, the Walmart parking lot where she sometimes stopped after work. He showed her photo to every cashier, every night shift worker, everyone who might have seen her pass by. The answer was always the same shake of the head, the same sympathetic frown. No one had seen her. As Saturday's sun climbed higher, Detective Webb stood in the police department's conference room, staring at a map of Bardstown covered in red marks indicating searched areas. His years of experience told him this case was already moving in a dark direction. Young women didn't just vanish from small Kentucky towns without reason. Either something terrible had happened on that drive home, or someone had made sure Natalie Hammond never arrived. The question haunting everyone was simple but devastating. What happened in those 15 minutes? And why did it feel like Natalie had been erased from existence? By Saturday morning, news of Natalie's disappearance had spread through Bardstown like wildfire. In a town this size, everyone knew someone who knew the Hammond family, and within hours, the entire community mobilized in a way that only small-town Kentucky could manage. Natalie's father, Robert Hammond, 62, a retired maintenance worker for Nelson County Schools, and her mother, Patricia, 59, a part-time cashier at Walmart, arrived at the police station before sunrise, their faces pale with terror. Patricia's hand shook so badly she could barely hold the coffee someone pressed into her palm. Robert stood silent, his jaw clenched, fighting to maintain composure when everything inside him was screaming. Natalie's younger sister, Claire, 24, immediately took charge of what would become a massive volunteer effort. She knew her family needed action, not helpless waiting. Within hours, she'd contacted a local print shop that agreed to rush produce 500 flyers. By noon Saturday, those flyers were being distributed across Bardstown, each one bearing Natalie's smiling face from her engagement party just 3 months earlier. Her auburn hair cascaded over her shoulders, her eyes bright with joy, completely unaware that photo would soon be plastered across telephone poles and storefront windows throughout Nelson County. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By Saturday afternoon, volunteers descended on the courthouse square from every corner of Bardstown. The owners of Mammy's Kitchen, a beloved local restaurant, set up tables offering free coffee and breakfast sandwiches to search teams. Employees from Maker's Mark and Jim Beam distilleries showed up in their work boots, ready to comb through rough terrain. Teachers from Nelson County High School, where Natalie had graduated a decade earlier, organized search grids. Even Bourbon tourists passing through town stopped to ask how they could help. St. Joseph Catholic Church, where the Hammond family had attended services for generations, became the unofficial headquarters for civilian search efforts. Father Michael Brennan, a soft-spoken priest who'd baptized both Natalie and Claire, opened the church doors day and night. Inside, candles flickered before the altar as parishioners knelt in prayer, their whispered supplications rising toward the vaulted ceiling. Patricia spent hours there, clutching her rosary until her knuckles turned white, repeating the same prayer over and over. Bring her home. Please, God, bring my daughter home. The church parking lot transformed into command central. Volunteers checked in, received assigned search areas, and headed out in groups. They walked through Bernheim Forest, calling Natalie's name until their voices went hoarse. They checked abandoned barns and empty properties throughout the county. They knocked on doors in rural areas, asking if anyone had security cameras that might have caught a silver Honda driving past on Friday night. Local media jumped on the story immediately. WBRT radio interrupted regular programming with urgent appeals, the announcer's voice carrying across the county's farmland and into every home. If you've seen Natalie Hammond or her silver Honda Civic, license plate Kentucky 729 MKT, please call Bardstown Police immediately. A family is desperate for answers. The Kentucky Standard, Bardstown's weekly newspaper, scrapped its planned front page to run Natalie's photo beneath a stark headline, "Local Woman Vanishes After Work Shift." But alongside the outpouring of support came something darker. Whispers, speculation, rumors that spread through diners on North 3rd Street and in the checkout lines at Kroger. Some people theorized Natalie's car had skidded off a dark road into one of the county's many creeks, that her body was submerged somewhere waiting to be found. Others whispered about human trafficking, pointing to news stories about women abducted from parking lots in Louisville and Lexington. And inevitably, suspicion began to circle around Ryan Caldwell. He was the fiancé, the last person to communicate with her, the one who stood to gain from her life insurance policy. And when volunteers noticed scratches on his hands and forearms, scratches he explained came from frantically searching through brambles and thorn bushes, the whispers grew louder. Detective Webb brought Ryan in for questioning 3 times in the first week. Each time, Ryan sat in the interview room at Bardstown Police Department under harsh overhead lights, answering the same questions. What time did Natalie leave work? When did you last speak to her? Were you having any relationship problems? Did she seem upset lately? Ryan's answers never changed. She texted at 6:45, saying she was on her way home. They were happy, planning a wedding for next spring. She had no reason to leave, no reason to disappear. When he didn't hear from her by 9:30, he started calling. By 10:15, he was panicked enough to contact police. Detectives examined Ryan's phone records, his computer history, his bank statements. They walked through the house on 3rd Street, looking for signs of struggle or violence. They interviewed his co-workers, his friends, his family. They administered a polygraph test, and every avenue of investigation pointed to the same conclusion. Ryan Caldwell appeared to be exactly what he claimed, a terrified man searching desperately for his missing fiancée. Still, the cloud of suspicion hung over him. In small towns, someone always has to be blamed when questions go unanswered, and the boyfriend, the fiancé, the husband, they're always the first suspect and often the last to be cleared in the court of public opinion. Meanwhile, search efforts continued. Dive teams checked Beach Fork River and Cox's Creek. Kentucky State Police brought in cadaver dogs to search wooded areas. Helicopters made repeated passes over Nelson County. But day after day, they found nothing. No silver Honda, no sign of Natalie, no evidence of what happened in those 15 minutes between leaving Heaven Hill and vanishing completely. By the end of the first week, a grim reality settled over Bardstown. Natalie Hammond was gone, and no one had any idea where to look next. If you're finding this story as gripping as we are, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who loves true crime. Your engagement helps us bring more stories like Natalie's to light. The question remained, haunting every volunteer who searched, every detective who investigated, every family member who prayed. Where was Natalie? And what force had been powerful enough to make a young woman disappear without a trace from her own hometown? As October turned to November and autumn leaves blanketed Bardstown in shades of rust and gold, the initial urgency began to fade into frustration. Detective Webb and his team had pursued every lead, followed every tip, interviewed dozens of potential witnesses, but each promising thread led nowhere. Heaven Hill's security footage had been analyzed frame by frame. The grainy video showed Natalie walking to her car at 6:43, backing out of her parking space and heading toward the exit. Traffic engineers enhanced the footage, trying to see if another vehicle had followed her, but the image quality was too poor and the lighting too dim to reveal anything useful. Beyond the distillery gates, there were no cameras to track her route. In 2013, Bardstown didn't have the extensive traffic camera network of larger cities. There were a few cameras at major intersections, but most had been out of service for maintenance or faced the wrong direction. Kentucky State Police collected what footage existed from gas stations and businesses along possible routes Natalie might have taken, but none showed her silver Honda. It was as if the car had simply evaporated into the Kentucky night. Reported sightings flooded in from across Nelson County and beyond. A man swore he'd seen a silver Honda near the Bluegrass Parkway entrance around 7 that evening. A woman called claiming she'd spotted Natalie at a gas station in Elizabethtown, but when detectives arrived, security footage proved it was someone else entirely. Another caller reported seeing a Honda matching the description pulled over on a rural road with a man leaning in the driver's window, but the timeline didn't match, and the license plate was different. Each false lead carved deeper wounds into the Hammond family's hope. Every phone call from Detective Webb sent Patricia's heart racing, only to crash when he explained it was another dead end. Robert stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night, lying awake listening for the sound of Natalie's car in the driveway, a sound that never came. The dive team's discovery of a submerged Honda in Beach Fork River sparked a brief, terrible moment of anticipation. Patricia collapsed when she heard, certain they'd found her daughter. But when the vehicle was pulled from the water, it turned out to be a different model, a different color, belonging to a car reported stolen months earlier. The relief that it wasn't Natalie lasted only seconds before the crushing disappointment returned. If it wasn't her, where was she? 6 months into the investigation, Detective Webb requested a meeting with the Hammond family. They gathered in a small conference room at Bardstown Police Department on a gray March afternoon. Robert and Patricia sat close together, hands clasped. Claire sat across from them, her notebook open, filled with her own research and questions. Ryan stood near the back wall, his face gaunt from months of sleepless nights. Detective Webb's weathered face showed the weight of 6 months spent chasing ghosts. "I want you to know we're not giving up," he began, but everyone in the room knew what came next. He explained that active daily investigation would have to scale back. Resources were limited. Other cases demanded attention, but Natalie's file would remain open, reviewed regularly, ready to be activated the moment new evidence emerged. The words hit like a physical blow. Patricia's quiet sobs filled the room. Robert stared at the table, his jaw working as he fought to maintain composure. Claire's pen stilled on her notebook page, her vision blurring with tears. Ryan turned to face the wall, shoulders shaking. "Cold case," Claire finally said, her voice hollow. "That's what you're saying. She's becoming a cold case." Detective Webb couldn't meet her eyes. In his 20 years on the force, this moment never got easier. Telling a family that their loved one might never be found, that the answers they desperately needed might stay buried forever. "We'll keep looking," he promised. "Any new technology, any new tip, we'll pursue it. But right now, we've exhausted every active lead." The statistics were grim. Detective Webb didn't share them with the family, but he knew them by heart. When a missing person isn't found in the first 48 hours, the chances of a safe recovery drop dramatically. When 6 months pass with no body, no evidence, no witnesses, cases often remain unsolved for years or even decades. Natalie's file would join hundreds of others across Kentucky, each one representing a family frozen in time, waiting for answers that might never come. On paper, Natalie Grace Hammond became case number 2013-0847 in Bardstown Police Department's records, filed, reviewed quarterly, marked with a red stamp, open, cold. But to the Hammond family, she was still their daughter, their sister, the woman whose laugh filled their home, and whose absence left a void nothing could fill. The transition from active investigation to cold case felt like a second loss. The first was Natalie's disappearance. The second was the gradual acceptance that she might never be found, that the question of what happened on October 11th, 2013, might haunt them forever. In the Hammond family's modest home on Withrow Court, time stopped on October 11th, 2013. While Bardstown continued its rhythm of bourbon festivals and high school football games, while neighbors celebrated holidays and marked milestones, the Hammond household existed in suspended grief. Robert built a memorial in their living room within weeks of Natalie being classified as missing. At its center sat her high school graduation photo, that radiant smile frozen in time, her auburn hair catching sunlight that no longer reached her. Around the photo, he carefully arranged items that told her story. The bourbon barrel charm she'd worn on a silver necklace, a gift from her first day working at Heaven Hill, a well-worn copy of My Old Kentucky Home sheet music from her choir days at Nelson County High School, ticket stubs from Louisville Cardinals basketball games they'd attended together, father and daughter sharing popcorn and cheering until their voices gave out. Before the memorial, Patricia placed a candle that never went dark. Each time one burned down to nothing, she'd light a new one, maintaining that constant flame as if it could guide Natalie home. Fresh flowers appeared weekly, usually daisies, Natalie's favorite since childhood. Patricia would replace them every Sunday after church, talking softly to her daughter's photo as she arranged the stems in a simple vase. The memorial became more than decoration. It became the family's emotional anchor, the one place where Natalie still felt present. Patricia stood before it every morning, whispering prayers before leaving for her shift at Walmart. Robert found himself talking to the photo late at night when sleep refused to come, telling Natalie about his day, asking her questions he knew would never be answered. "Where are you, sweetheart? What happened to you? Are you somewhere safe?" Claire's life shattered the day Natalie vanished. She'd been in her final year at Western Kentucky University, studying marketing, planning a career in Louisville. But after Natalie disappeared, concentrating on coursework felt impossible. How could she write papers about consumer behavior when her sister was missing? How could she sit in lecture halls pretending everything was normal when her family was drowning? 3 months after Natalie vanished, Claire withdrew from university. She moved back home, unable to bear the thought of her parents grieving alone. She took a job at a local insurance office, work that paid bills but meant nothing to her. Every spare moment went to keeping Natalie's case alive. She created a Facebook page, Find Natalie Hammond, posting updates, sharing similar cases from across the country, connecting with other families trapped in the same nightmare of uncertainty. The page became Claire's obsession and her therapy. On slow afternoons at the insurance office, she'd scroll through databases of unidentified remains found across Kentucky and neighboring states. Each profile made her stomach turn. Jane Doe, discovered in Tennessee, approximately 25 to 30 years old. Unidentified female, found in Ohio, auburn hair. She'd compare dental records and physical descriptions, terrified of finding a match, but desperate for any answer, even the worst one. Ryan Caldwell remained a fixture in the Hammond home those first few years. He'd come for Sunday dinners that tasted like dust, where conversation happened in quiet murmurs and laughter felt like betrayal. He kept the Cape Cod house on 3rd Street, exactly as Natalie had left it. Her coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter, a faint ring stained into its bottom. Her jacket still hung by the front door. Her shampoo still stood in the shower, slowly separating as months became years. The engagement ring he'd planned to see on her finger forever sat in a velvet box on his nightstand. Some mornings he'd open it, staring at the small diamond that represented a future that would never arrive. He went through the motions of living, working his project manager job at a Louisville construction firm, but colleagues noticed the hollow look in his eyes, the way he seemed to exist rather than live. As years passed, the dynamics shifted. Ryan's visits became less frequent. The weight of being around the Hammond family's grief, combined with the lingering suspicion some neighbors still harbored, took its toll. By 2016, 3 years after Natalie vanished, Ryan had distanced himself, maintaining contact through occasional phone calls but no longer joining family gatherings. No one blamed him. Grief was exhausting, and everyone processed it differently. Patricia's hair turned fully gray by Natalie's 3rd missing anniversary. The stress carved deep lines around her eyes and mouth, aging her a decade in just a few years. She still worked at Walmart, scanning items with mechanical precision, while her mind wandered to dark places. Regular customers who knew her story would squeeze her hand at checkout, whispering, "Still praying for you," and she'd nod, grateful but exhausted by well-meaning sympathy that couldn't change anything. Robert grew quieter with each passing year. He spent hours in his workshop, building nothing in particular, just needing his hands busy so his mind couldn't spiral into worst-case scenarios. He'd pick up wood, measure it, cut it, sand it, but never completed any project. The workshop became his refuge, where he didn't have to pretend to be okay, where he could simply exist in his pain. Each October 11th, the Hammond family held a memorial vigil at St. Joseph Catholic Church. Father Brennan would lead prayers for Natalie's soul and for answers that refused to come. The first year, the sanctuary overflowed with attendees, hundreds of candles flickering in the darkness. The second year, the crowd was smaller but still substantial. By the 5th year, attendance had dwindled to family, close friends, and a handful of dedicated community members who refused to forget. Life moved on for Bardstown. Friends and neighbors meant well, but memories fade when years pass without resolution. The urgency of a 5-year-old disappearance couldn't compete with immediate concerns like mortgage payments, children's soccer games, and the daily demands of survival. People still asked about Natalie when they saw the Hammonds at church or the grocery store, but the questions became more awkward, less frequent, eventually trailing off into uncomfortable silence. Natalie's family never gave up, even when the world moved on. If their story resonates with you, drop a comment below. Has something like this ever touched your community? We read every single one. Claire maintained her vigil online. The Find Natalie Hammond Facebook page continued posting updates every week, even when there was nothing new to report. She shared articles about advances in forensic technology, cases solved after decades, anything that suggested hope wasn't completely lost. She attended conferences on missing persons, sitting in hotel ballrooms listening to experts discuss DNA analysis and cold case investigation strategies, taking notes as if studying for the most important exam of her life. The Hammond home remained frozen in October 2013. Natalie's bedroom stayed exactly as she'd left it. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Her perfume bottles still lined the dresser, the scents slowly evaporating into air that felt too heavy to breathe. Patricia couldn't bring herself to change anything, as if moving Natalie's belongings would be admitting she was never coming back. Holidays became cruel reminders of absence. Christmas mornings lacked joy. Thanksgiving tables held an empty chair. Natalie's birthday on June 14th passed in silence, Patricia baking a cake no one ate, singing happy birthday in a trembling voice to an empty room. Each milestone felt like another small death, another piece of hope crumbling away. 7 years, 7 October 11ths, 7 birthday cakes uneaten, 7 Christmases without her laughter, 7 years of the same unanswered question burning in their hearts. Where was Natalie? And who was responsible for the hole torn through their family? Through it all, the candle burned before Natalie's photo. A small flame in the darkness, a refusal to accept that some questions would never be answered. The Hammond family clung to one thread of hope, that truth had a way of surfacing, even when buried deep, that someone, somewhere, knew something, that one day the silence would break. They believed because they had to, because giving up meant accepting that Natalie was truly gone forever. And that was something they couldn't do. By March 2020, 7 years had passed since Natalie vanished. The world was changing rapidly as COVID-19 began its spread across America, shutting down bourbon distillery tours and keeping families locked in their homes. But in the Hammond household, isolation was nothing new. They'd been living in a kind of quarantine since October 2013, separated from normal life by grief and unanswered questions. Claire sat at her kitchen table late on March 10th, scrolling through the Find Natalie Hammond Facebook page as she did every night before bed. The routine had become second nature. She'd respond to messages from other families of missing persons, people who understood the specific torture of not knowing. She'd check for any new tips, though they'd become rare as years passed. Most nights brought nothing but the same old posts, the same recycled hope. Then a notification appeared, a new message from an account she didn't recognize. The profile had been created just hours earlier. No photo, no personal information, just a generic name. Truth Seeker. Claire almost deleted it. Anonymous accounts usually meant conspiracy theorists or cruel people sending hurtful speculation. But something made her click it open. Her heart stopped as she read the words. I know something about Natalie Hammond. I've known for years. I can't stay silent anymore. Check Ryan Caldwell's cabin on Bernheim Forest Road. He owned property there in 2013. No one ever searched it. Her hands began shaking so violently she nearly dropped her phone. She read the message again, then a third time, her mind racing. A cabin? Ryan owned a cabin? The initial investigation had been thorough, hadn't it? They'd searched everywhere, questioned everyone, examined every aspect of Ryan's life. How could a cabin have been missed? Claire screenshot the message, her fingers fumbling on the keyboard. She pulled up Sergeant Marcus Webb's contact information. He'd been promoted to head of Bardstown Police Department's detective unit 2 years earlier, and he'd given Claire his personal cell phone number with instructions to call any time, day or night, if she learned anything new. At 11:47 that night, Claire called. Webb answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep, but immediately alert when he heard her name. Sergeant Webb, I got a message, an anonymous message about Natalie. Her voice came out too fast, words tripping over each other. Someone says Ryan owned a cabin on Bernheim Forest Road in 2013. Says it was never searched. Is that true? How could we not know about a cabin? Webb was fully awake now, sitting up in bed, reaching for the notepad he always kept on his nightstand. Send me that screenshot right now, he said. Don't respond to the message. Don't do anything. I need to verify this information before we proceed. The next 48 hours moved both painfully slow and terrifyingly fast. Sergeant Webb pulled Natalie's entire case file, reviewing every document from 2013. Then he contacted Kentucky State Police Post 4 and requested assistance from their cold case unit. Detective Lauren Hayes, a specialist in long unsolved cases, arrived in Bardstown the following morning. Together, they began tracking property records. What they discovered made Webb's stomach turn. In July 2012, 15 months before Natalie's disappearance, a property purchase had been recorded in Nelson County. A small cabin on 2.3 acres off Bernheim Forest Road. The purchase had been made through an LLC, a limited liability company that obscured the true owner's identity. The property taxes had been paid through an automated bank account, the kind of setup that could easily slip through the cracks during an investigation focused on more obvious assets. They dug deeper. The LLC's registration documents, buried in state records, listed Ryan Caldwell as the principal member. He owned that cabin. He'd owned it when Natalie vanished. And somehow, in the chaos of the initial investigation, this crucial detail had been overlooked. Webb felt sick. 7 years. 7 years that property had sat there while the Hammond family suffered, while search parties scoured every inch of Nelson County except that one crucial location. How had they missed it? The answer was painful but simple. In 2013, Ryan had been asked to list his assets. He'd complied, providing documentation through his attorney. But the cabin, purchased through an LLC for what Ryan had claimed was a potential investment property, hadn't been listed under his personal name in any easily accessible database. And with everything else happening, with dozens of leads to chase and limited resources, it had fallen through the cracks. Detective Hayes pulled satellite imagery of the property. The cabin sat isolated, accessible only by a rutted dirt road winding through dense hardwood forest. The kind of place you could hide something and be confident it would never be found. On March 15, 2020, a plan was set in motion. Bardstown Police Department coordinated with Kentucky State Police, the Nelson County Sheriff's Department, and the FBI. A search warrant was obtained based on the anonymous tip and the newly discovered property ownership. No one was taking chances. If there was even a possibility that the cabin held evidence related to Natalie's disappearance, they would tear it apart board by board if necessary. That morning, Sergeant Webb made the call to Claire. "We found the cabin," he said. "It's real. Ryan did own property he never disclosed. We're executing a search warrant this afternoon. I'll call you the moment we know anything." Claire sat down hard, her legs unable to hold her weight. 7 years of waiting, 7 years of praying for a break in the case. And now, from an anonymous message sent by someone who'd remained silent all this time, they finally had a new direction to search. Who had sent that message? Why now, after 7 years? What did they know, and why had they waited so long to come forward? Those questions would haunt everyone involved. But right now, they didn't matter. What mattered was the cabin sitting in those woods, waiting to reveal whatever secrets it had held since October 2013. On March 15, 2020, a convoy of law enforcement vehicles wound through the back roads of Nelson County. Bardstown Police Department, Kentucky State Police, FBI, and Nelson County Sheriff's deputies, all heading toward the coordinates that matched the property owned by Ryan Caldwell's LLC. The dirt road leading to the cabin was barely visible from Bernheim Forest Road, overgrown with years of neglect, branches scraping against vehicle sides as they navigated deeper into the woods. Detective Lauren Hayes sat in the lead vehicle with Sergeant Webb, both silent as they approached. The cabin appeared through the trees like something out of a forgotten time. Small, one room with a loft, the kind of hunting camp or weekend retreat common throughout rural Kentucky. But this one showed clear signs of long abandonment. Windows were clouded with grime. The porch sagged slightly. Dead leaves had piled against the foundation from 7 autumns of neglect. The door hung slightly ajar, whether from weather damage or something else, no one could tell. Hayes pulled on latex gloves, adjusted her flashlight, and approached with Webb behind her. The FBI's forensic team held back, waiting for the initial sweep before bringing in their equipment. The smell hit them first as Hayes pushed the door fully open. Musty air, thick with mold and decay, the scent of wood rot and years of moisture seeping through inadequate walls. Inside, the cabin appeared nearly empty. A folding card table sat in one corner, 2 metal folding chairs, a small wood stove covered in rust. No electricity, no running water, nothing to suggest anyone had spent time here recently. But Hayes had worked enough cold cases to know that what you don't see is often more important than what you do. She swept her flashlight across the rough plank floor, looking for inconsistencies. The beam caught something near the far corner of the main room. The floorboards there sat slightly askew, misaligned compared to the rest of the floor. "Marcus," she said quietly, and Webb moved to her side. They both saw it. The boards had been removed and replaced, but whoever did it hadn't lined them up perfectly. Time and settling had made the imperfection more obvious. Webb called for the forensic team. Within minutes, specialists in protective gear entered the cabin, photographing everything before anyone touched a single board. Then, carefully, using pry bars and gloved hands, they began lifting those misaligned planks. Beneath the floor was a crawl space, about 3 feet deep, packed with dirt and darkness. Hayes directed her flashlight downward, and her breath caught in her throat. There, wrapped in plastic sheeting and a heavy tarp, were unmistakable shapes. Human remains, partially preserved by the plastic, partially deteriorated from 7 years in damp earth beneath a forgotten cabin floor. The forest went absolutely silent in that moment. No one spoke. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Hayes stepped back, her professional composure intact, but her heart hammering. After 7 years of searching, after countless false leads and dead ends, Natalie Hammond had been found. The scene was immediately secured. Yellow crime scene tapes surrounded the entire property. The forensic team worked with painstaking care, documenting every detail before attempting to remove anything. Each photograph, each measurement, each fiber collected could be crucial for prosecution. The remains were carefully extracted from beneath the floor, treated with the dignity denied them for 7 years. The plastic wrapping and tarp were preserved as evidence. A medical examiner from Kentucky State would make the official determination, but everyone present knew what they'd found. As forensic specialists continued processing the main room, other investigators searched the loft area. Behind insulation in the rafters, one agent found a cardboard box. Inside, protected from the elements, were items that made identification certain: women's clothing, a silver chain with a bourbon barrel charm, and a key fob bearing the Honda logo. Hayes held the key fob in her gloved hand, remembering the case details she'd studied. Natalie had driven a silver Honda Civic. This was her car key, which meant she'd been at this cabin, and she'd never left. The discovery sent law enforcement into motion. While forensic teams continued processing the cabin, other units began searching the surrounding property for any additional evidence. They found tire tracks, old but still visible in the clay soil near the cabin. They found what appeared to be a makeshift fire pit where someone had burned material, the ashes too deteriorated to identify. They photographed everything, mapped the property, prepared for what would eventually become a murder investigation. That afternoon, Sergeant Webb stood outside the Hammond family's home on Withrow Court, steeling himself for what came next. He'd delivered difficult news many times in his career, but this moment weighed heavier than most. He knocked on the door. Patricia answered, her face immediately draining of color when she saw his expression. Robert appeared behind her, and Claire rushed from the kitchen. They all knew before Webb said a word. "We found Natalie's car key and personal belongings at the cabin," Webb said carefully, his voice gentle but clear. "And we found human remains. We'll need DNA confirmation, but I believe we found your daughter." Patricia's knees buckled. Robert caught her before she hit the floor, but he wasn't much steadier himself. Claire stood frozen, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Where?" Patricia managed to whisper. "Where was she?" "The cabin on Bernheim Forest Road," Webb said quietly. "The property Ryan owned. I'm so sorry." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. 7 years of waiting, of hoping against hope that maybe Natalie was alive somewhere, that maybe she'd lost her memory or been held captive or run away for reasons they couldn't understand. Any scenario had seemed better than this truth. She'd been in Nelson County the whole time, just miles from their home, buried beneath a cabin floor while they hung flyers and organized search parties and prayed desperately for her return. Robert guided Patricia to the couch, his own tears falling unchecked. Claire sank to the floor, her body shaking with sobs. The memorial they'd maintained for 7 years, the candle that never went dark, the flowers replaced every Sunday, all of it had been in honor of someone who was already gone, someone who'd never had a chance to come home. Webb stayed with them, making phone calls to family members, providing what comfort he could while knowing nothing would ease this pain. The worst kind of confirmation, the end of hope. But also, though they couldn't see it yet through their grief, the beginning of something else, the chance for justice, the opportunity to finally understand what happened on October 11th, 2013, and most importantly, the ability to bring Natalie home with dignity and lay her to rest as she deserved. In the woods off Bernheim Forest Road, investigators continued their work as afternoon faded into evening. Forensic lights illuminated the cabin, casting strange shadows through the trees. Evidence bags accumulated, each one labeled and cataloged. And slowly, carefully, the remains of Natalie Grace Hammond were prepared for transport to the medical examiner's office in Louisville. After 7 years hidden in darkness, Natalie was finally found. But the question now shifted from, where is she, to something much more demanding. Who put her there? And why? The wait for DNA confirmation felt endless, despite lasting only 3 weeks. The Kentucky State Medical Examiner's office in Louisville worked carefully, extracting viable DNA from the remains found beneath the cabin. They compared it against a sample provided by Claire, whose genetic material would show sibling markers. On April 9, 2020, the official report arrived. Sergeant Webb and Detective Hayes read it together in the Bardstown Police Department conference room before calling the Hammond family. The language was clinical and precise, but the conclusion was definitive. The DNA extracted from the skeletal remains matched Claire Hammond's sample, with a sibling probability of 99.97%. The victim was Natalie Grace Hammond, but the report contained more than just identification. The medical examiner's findings painted a devastating picture. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull. The damage indicated multiple impacts from a heavy object, possibly a hammer or similar tool. Manner of death: homicide. This was no accident, no tragic misunderstanding. Someone had beaten Natalie Hammond to death and hidden her body beneath that cabin floor. Webb made the call to the Hammond family, arranging to meet at their home. When he delivered the news, Robert clutched his face, his entire body trembling. David slumped onto the table, unable to hold himself upright under the weight of confirmation. Patricia, though she'd suspected this outcome since the moment remains were discovered, still collapsed into grief when the official words were spoken. "We suspected it after finding her," Webb said gently, "but now we know for certain, and I promise you we're going to find out who did this." The homicide determination shifted everything. This was no longer a missing person case. It was murder. And with murder came the full force of law enforcement resources. Hayes immediately began coordinating with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit and Evidence Response Team. Every fiber, every trace, every microscopic piece of evidence from that cabin would be analyzed with technology that hadn't existed in 2013. Forensic specialists had found biological traces in the cabin beyond Natalie's remains, on the folded chair, on the door handle, and most significantly, on pieces of rope found wrapped with the plastic sheeting. There were skin cells and hair follicles that didn't belong to Natalie. The DNA was extracted and entered into CODIS, the national database containing millions of criminal DNA profiles from across the country. While waiting for database results, Hayes ordered a complete re-examination of Ryan Caldwell's life in 2013. The initial investigation had cleared him, but finding Natalie's body at his secretly owned property changed everything. Every phone record, every credit card statement, every movement needed fresh analysis. A digital forensics team subpoenaed Ryan's old phone records from 2013, specifically requesting cell tower data with enhanced analysis, techniques unavailable 7 years earlier. Modern technology could now pinpoint phone locations more precisely, track patterns invisible to older systems. What they discovered made Detective Hayes pause and read the report twice to be certain she understood correctly. Throughout 2012 and 2013, Ryan's phone had been in frequent contact with another number. Hundreds of text messages, late-night calls lasting hours. The number was registered to a woman named Melissa Tran, 33 years old, working as a pharmaceutical sales representative based in Louisville. During the initial investigation in 2013, Ryan had mentioned Melissa only in passing. She was someone he'd met at a professional networking event, a casual acquaintance, nothing significant. Detectives had spoken to her briefly, and she'd confirmed barely knowing Ryan, seeing him occasionally at industry conferences, but maintaining no real relationship. The phone records told a completely different story. The communications between Ryan and Melissa began in January 2012, just after a conference in Louisville that both attended. From there, the frequency increased steadily. By summer 2012, they were texting daily. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who'd investigated infidelity cases. Ryan Caldwell and Melissa Tran had been having an affair. Hayes cross-referenced the phone data with Ryan's credit card statements. Hotel charges in Louisville appeared regularly, always on weekends when Natalie was working evening shifts at Heaven Hill. Restaurant charges in Lexington matched dates when Melissa's sales territory took her to that city. Cell tower records showed Ryan's phone and Melissa's phone pinging off the same towers at the same times, again and again, proving they'd been together repeatedly throughout 2012 and well into 2013. "He lied," Webb said flatly, staring at the evidence. "He told us she was barely an acquaintance. He was having a full-blown affair." But the most damaging piece of evidence was the cell tower data from October 11th, 2013. The night Natalie disappeared, Ryan's phone had pinged off towers along Route 245 and then near Bernheim Forest Road between 7 and 8 p.m., exactly where the cabin was located. That aligned with the timeline. Natalie left Heaven Hill at 6:46, driving toward what she thought was home. But she'd been diverted somehow to the cabin, arriving around 7. And here was the detail that made Hayes's blood run cold. Melissa Tran's phone had also pinged off a tower near Bernheim Forest Road that same evening. Between 7:15 and 8:30, her phone was in the same general area as Ryan's. She'd been there, at or near the cabin. The night Natalie died, Hayes and Webb brought Melissa in for questioning on April 20th. She arrived at Kentucky State Police Post 4 in Elizabethtown with an attorney, her face carefully composed, professional attire neat and pressed. But when confronted with the phone records, with the undeniable evidence of her location on the night of a murder, her composure cracked. The interview room was small and windowless. Hayes and Webb sat across from Melissa and her attorney, a thick folder of evidence between them. Hayes opened with the phone records, showing Melissa page after page of calls and texts with Ryan. "You told investigators in 2013 that you barely knew Ryan Caldwell," Hayes said. "That was a lie. You were having an affair with him." Melissa's attorney started to object, but Melissa waved him off. Her hand shook as she picked up the glass of water in front of her. "Yes," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were having an affair." "Tell us about it," Webb said, not unkindly, but firmly. The story poured out. Melissa and Ryan had met at a Louisville conference in January 2012. The attraction was immediate. Ryan told her he was engaged, but unhappy, that he was only staying with Natalie because she was emotionally fragile and he was afraid of what she might do if he left. Melissa believed him. They began meeting secretly, talking for hours, planning a future together once Ryan ended his engagement. "Did he ever talk about ending the engagement?" Hayes asked. "All the time," Melissa said, tears welling up. "He kept saying he would tell her soon, that he just needed the right moment, that he loved me and wanted to be with me." "Did you ever meet Natalie?" "No, Ryan said it would be too complicated, that we needed to keep the relationship quiet until he could break it off properly." Hayes leaned forward. "Did Ryan ever mention having property in Nelson County? A cabin?" Melissa's face went pale. She glanced at her attorney, who gave her a slight nod. "Yes," she whispered. "He called it his thinking space, a place he could go to get away from stress. He took me there a few times, said Natalie didn't know about it." The interrogation continued for hours. What emerged was a picture of a man leading a double life, promising Melissa a future while planning a wedding with Natalie. The pressure of maintaining both relationships must have been enormous. And then, somehow, the secret came out. Hayes showed Melissa another piece of evidence, recently recovered through digital forensics, text messages from Natalie's iCloud backup, messages that had been automatically saved even though her phone was never recovered. On October 11th, 2013, at 4:30 in the afternoon, Natalie had sent Ryan a text message. "I know about Melissa. We need to talk. Tonight." Ryan's response came minutes later. "Come to my cabin after your shift. We can talk privately. I can explain everything. Please. I love you." Natalie, trusting the man she'd agreed to marry, had driven directly from Heaven Hill to the cabin on Bernheim Forest Road, into a trap she never saw coming. "Did you know Ryan planned to meet Natalie that night?" Hayes asked. Melissa's tears were flowing freely now. "He called me that afternoon, said Natalie found text messages on his iPad that she knew about us. He was panicking, said he needed to talk to her, to explain things. He asked me to come to the cabin after, to be there for moral support." "What time did you arrive at the cabin?" Melissa's voice dropped to barely audible. "Around 7:15, maybe 7:20. "And what did you see when you got there?" This was the moment. The attorney put his hand on Melissa's arm, but she shook her head. 7 years of carrying this secret had been too long. "Ryan was outside," she said, her voice breaking. "He looked terrified. Her car was there, the Honda. He said there'd been an accident, that they'd argued, and she'd fallen and hit her head. He said she was dead. He said we had to do something or he'd go to prison." The confession continued. Melissa claimed Ryan had already wrapped Natalie's body in plastic sheeting by the time she arrived. He dug up the floorboards in the cabin, creating a makeshift grave in the crawlspace beneath. He begged Melissa to help him, told her they'd both be implicated if anyone found out. She'd helped him dispose of Natalie's car, driving it to a remote location where it was later stripped and sold through illegal channels. Hayes and Webb listened, documenting every word. Whether Melissa had arrived after Natalie was already dead or had been present during the murder itself would be for prosecutors to determine. But her admission of helping hide the body and lying to investigators made her an accessory at minimum. By the time the interrogation ended, the picture was complete. Ryan Caldwell had been living a lie. Caught between two women, he'd chosen murder over honesty. And Melissa Tran, whether out of love or fear or both, had helped him hide that crime for 7 years. The breakthrough everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. Not just where Natalie was, but who put her there and why. The case was no longer cold. It was burning hot, racing toward arrests and prosecution, and finally, after 7 impossible years, justice. With Melissa Tran's confession on record, prosecutors faced a critical decision. She could be charged with conspiracy to commit murder, accessory after the fact, and obstruction of justice, charges that combined could put her in prison for life. Or she could accept a plea deal, reduced charges in exchange for testifying against Ryan Caldwell at trial. Melissa's attorney negotiated carefully. She'd made admissions, yes, but she maintained she arrived after Natalie was already dead, that she'd been manipulated by a man she loved, that fear had kept her silent. After days of discussions, a deal was struck. Melissa would plead guilty to accessory after the fact to murder and hindering prosecution. In exchange, she'd receive 10 years in prison with possibility of parole after 8, and she'd provide full testimony against Ryan. The agreement was controversial. Claire Hammond told reporters she felt Melissa deserved far more prison time, that helping hide her sister's body for 7 years was unforgivable. But prosecutors knew conviction cases are built on solid evidence, and Melissa's testimony would be devastating at trial. While plea negotiations proceeded, detectives continued building the case against Ryan. Digital forensics provided perhaps the most damning evidence beyond the physical remains. Ryan's computer and tablet, seized during the initial 2013 investigation, but not analyzed with modern technology, were sent to the FBI's Cyber Division. What they found painted a picture of premeditation that destroyed any claim of accidental death. Ryan's internet search history from October 2013 included queries that made Detective Hayes feel physically ill reading them. October 9th, 2013. Can police trace deleted text messages? October 10th, 2013. How long does human body take to decompose? October 11th, 2013, 3:47 p.m. Blunt force trauma versus strangulation, which easier to prove? October 11th, 2013, 5:23 p.m. Can bleach destroy DNA evidence? October 12th, 2013. Police search protocols missing person Kentucky. October 15th, 2013. Can dental records identify badly decomposed remains? The searches showed clear consciousness of guilt and planning. This wasn't a panicked cover-up of an accident. This was calculated murder, followed by deliberate concealment. Further investigation revealed more lies from Ryan's original statements. He'd told detectives in 2013 that he'd been home all evening waiting for Natalie, that he'd never left the house on 3rd Street. But cell tower records proved he'd been near the cabin. Security footage from a gas station on Bernheim Forest Road, recovered during the 2020 reinvestigation, showed Ryan's truck pulling in at 8:47 p.m. on October 11th, 2013. He'd filled up the tank and purchased bleach and trash bags. The gas station clerk from 2013 was tracked down and interviewed. I remember that night because he seemed really nervous, she told detectives. Kept looking around like he was afraid someone would see him. Surveillance footage also captured another vehicle at the same gas station around the same time. A sedan matching Melissa Tran's car. The two had been there together, purchasing supplies for covering up a murder. But perhaps the most heartbreaking piece of evidence came from Natalie herself. The text message recovered from her iCloud backup showed her final communication. October 11th, 2013, 6:42 p.m. to Ryan. I'm leaving work now, on my way to the cabin. We'll figure this out. I love you. She'd gone to her death believing they would talk, that Ryan would explain the affair, that their relationship could be salvaged. She trusted him completely, even knowing he'd betrayed her. That trust had killed her. The case against Ryan Caldwell was now overwhelming. DNA evidence placing him at the crime scene, cell phone records proving he'd been at the cabin, computer searches showing premeditation, Melissa's testimony describing his actions, security footage of him buying cleaning supplies, and Natalie's own words proving he'd lured her to an isolated location. On May 3, 2020, an arrest warrant was issued. Ryan had moved to Louisville in 2018, distancing himself from Bardstown and the Hammond family. He lived in a modern apartment in the Highlands neighborhood, had a good job, maintained the appearance of a successful professional who'd moved on from a tragic past. The arrest happened at dawn. FBI agents and Louisville Metro Police surrounded the apartment building. When Ryan answered his door in pajama pants and a t-shirt, confused and half asleep, he was immediately handcuffed. Ryan Caldwell, you're under arrest for the murder of Natalie Grace Hammond, the lead FBI agent said. You have the right to remain silent. Ryan's face went through a series of expressions. Confusion, then recognition, then something that might have been resignation. He didn't resist, didn't ask what they were talking about, just stood there as cuffs were applied, as his rights were read, as his life as a free man ended. 2 hours later, Melissa Tran was arrested at her Louisville home under the terms of her plea agreement. Though she'd be sentenced later, the arrest was procedural, part of officially charging her with the crimes she'd admitted. The news broke across Kentucky like a thunderclap. Headlines screamed from every newspaper. Fiancé arrested in 2013. Bardstown murder. Cold case solved. Ryan Caldwell charged with killing missing Bourbon country woman. The story spread nationally, picked up by crime networks and true crime podcasts. A case of betrayal so complete it seemed almost impossible to believe. In Bardstown, the reaction was pure shock. The man who'd searched alongside volunteers, who'd attended vigils, who'd cried in church beside the Hammond family, had murdered Natalie and hidden her for 7 years. People who'd hugged him, consoled him, helped him search, felt violated, betrayed. At Mammy's kitchen, where Ryan had eaten countless breakfasts with volunteers during search efforts, the owner couldn't find words when reporters asked for comment. At St. Joseph Catholic Church, Father Brennan addressed a stunned congregation. "Evil sometimes wears the most familiar face," he said, his voice heavy. "We prayed alongside someone who knew exactly where Natalie was. That violation cuts to the heart of what community means." Former search volunteers expressed rage and grief. "He called her name with us," one man told the Kentucky Standard, tears running down his weathered face. "We stood on ridges shouting for Natalie while he knew she was under that cabin floor. How do you live with yourself doing that?" Social media exploded. Facebook groups dedicated to Natalie's case, which had been quiet for years, suddenly surged with activity. Old photos of Ryan at vigils circulated with comments calling him monster and devil. Melissa's professional LinkedIn profile was bombarded with messages. Death threats came in such volume that both defendants required protection. But the deepest wound was to the Hammond family. The man who'd held Patricia's hand during the darkest nights. The man who'd helped Robert hang missing person flyers. The man who'd reassured Claire they'd find her sister. He'd murdered Natalie and then performed grief while her body decomposed beneath his cabin. "I hugged him," Patricia told Detective Hayes, her voice hollow. "After the first year, I told him I knew how much he loved her. I thanked him for not giving up, and every word was a lie. He was lying to my face while my daughter was in the ground." Robert's reaction was colder, harder. "I'll sit in that courtroom every day," he told reporters. "I'll make sure he has to look at us, at what he destroyed." Claire channeled her betrayal into action. She immediately created a new Facebook group, Justice for Natalie Hammond, dedicated to ensuring the trial had maximum visibility and that Ryan faced the full weight of his crimes. The tight-knit community that had rallied around Ryan as a fellow victim now turned their support entirely to the Hammond family, but the damage was done. Bardstown's sense of trust had been shattered. If Ryan Caldwell could deceive an entire town for 7 years, who else might be hiding terrible secrets behind friendly smiles? The case became a dark lesson in how well evil can masquerade as innocence. How a murderer can not only walk free among his victim's family, but can insert himself into their grief, perform emotions he doesn't feel, and maintain the lie year after year. Ryan Caldwell had done more than murder Natalie Hammond. He'd weaponized her family's trust, their community's compassion, their desperate need for answers. He'd made them complicit in his deception simply by believing his performance. And now, finally, that performance was over. The mask had fallen. The truth was revealed. All that remained was justice. Ryan Caldwell's trial began on September 14, 2020, at Nelson County Circuit Court in Bardstown. The prosecution was led by Commonwealth's attorney Sarah Mitchell, a veteran prosecutor with a reputation for methodical, evidence-driven cases. Ryan's defense team argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that Melissa Tran's testimony was unreliable, that reasonable doubt existed. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Every day, the Hammond family sat in the front row. Robert, Patricia, and Claire arrived early, stayed late, their presence a constant reminder of what Ryan had taken from them. The prosecution's case was devastating. Forensic experts testified about the DNA evidence found at the cabin. Cell phone analysts explained the tower data, placing both Ryan and Melissa at the crime scene. The medical examiner described the blunt force trauma that killed Natalie, the multiple impacts indicating rage rather than accident. Digital forensic specialists walked the jury through Ryan's internet searches, each query more damning than the last. The recovered text messages were read aloud. Natalie's final words to Ryan, trusting him even after discovering his betrayal, brought audible sobs from the gallery. Patricia covered her face, Robert's hands clenched into fists. Claire stared directly at Ryan, refusing to look away. Melissa Tran testified on day 8. She walked the jury through the affair, Ryan's promises, the phone call on October 11th, when he'd panicked about Natalie discovering the truth. She described arriving at the cabin to find Ryan standing over Natalie's body, his hands bloody, a hammer on the floor nearby. She admitted helping dispose of the car, lying to investigators, maintaining the secret for 7 years. Under cross-examination, Ryan's attorney attacked Melissa's credibility. She'd lied for 7 years. She'd only come forward when caught. How could the jury trust anything she said? But her testimony aligned perfectly with physical evidence, with phone records, with everything prosecutors had built. Ryan didn't testify. His attorneys advised against it, knowing the prosecution would destroy him on cross-examination. Instead, they argued the evidence showed only that Ryan had been at the cabin, that Melissa could be the actual killer trying to frame him, that the internet searches could have innocent explanations. The jury didn't buy it. After deliberating for 6 hours on October 2nd, 2020, they returned with a verdict: guilty of murder, guilty of abuse of corpse, guilty of tampering with physical evidence. Ryan showed no emotion as the verdict was read. The Hammond family collapsed into each other's arms, tears of relief and grief mingling together. 7 years of waiting, 7 years of lies. Finally, accountability. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Commonwealth's Attorney Mitchell requested life without parole. The defense argued for the minimum 25 years. The judge, a stern woman who'd presided over Nelson County cases, for 2 decades addressed Ryan directly before sentencing. "You didn't just murder Natalie Hammond," she said, her voice cold with controlled anger. "You murdered her, hid her body, and then inserted yourself into her family's grief. You accepted their comfort, their trust, while knowing exactly where she was. That level of deception, that cruelty, demands the maximum penalty this court can impose." She sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. Ryan was led from the courtroom in shackles, still showing no emotion, no remorse, nothing. Melissa Tran received her sentence days later under the plea agreement. 10 years, eligible for parole after 8. Claire called it inadequate, but prosecutors explained it was necessary to secure Ryan's conviction. Outside the courthouse, the Hammond family addressed media gathered on the steps. Robert spoke, his voice steady despite tears. "Our daughter was murdered by someone she loved and trusted. We lived 7 years not knowing where she was. That pain doesn't end with a verdict, But at least now Natalie can rest. At least now there's justice. Patricia added quietly, "We forgive Ryan because our faith demands it. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't erase what he did. Natalie deserved so much better than what he gave her." Claire's statement was brief. "To anyone following this case, remember my sister not as a victim, but as the vibrant, loving person she was. And if you know something about any cold case, please speak up. 7 years could have been 7 days if someone had come forward sooner." The trial's conclusion brought closure, but closure isn't the same as healing. The Hammond family would carry this wound forever. But at least now they had answers. At least Natalie's killer was behind bars. And most importantly, they could finally bring Natalie home. On October 24th, 2020, nearly 7 years to the day after Natalie vanished, St. Joseph Catholic Church held the funeral service that should have happened in 2013. The sanctuary filled with hundreds of mourners, the same people who'd searched desperately 7 years earlier, now gathering to say goodbye. Natalie's casket, closed and covered in white roses, sat before the altar. The bourbon barrel charm she'd worn was placed on top, a symbol of her connection to Bardstown and the job she'd loved. Father Brennan delivered the homily, speaking of faith tested by unimaginable grief, of justice finally served, of a young woman who deserved so much more than the hand fate dealt her. Patricia and Robert sat in the front pew, their faces marked by 7 years of suffering. Claire delivered a eulogy that brought the entire congregation to tears. "My sister was kind, funny, loyal to a fault," she said, her voice breaking. "She saw the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. That trust was used against her, but I refuse to let her be remembered only as a victim. She was so much more." The burial took place at Bardstown Cemetery under October sun, golden leaves falling around the gathered crowd. As Natalie's casket was lowered into the ground, Patricia placed a single daisy on top, the flowers Natalie had loved since childhood. Robert stood with his arm around his wife, both finally able to grieve properly now that their daughter was home. The memorial in their living room, maintained for 7 years, was carefully packed away. The candle that never went dark was finally extinguished. Not forgotten, but transformed. Natalie's photo was placed in a position of honor, surrounded by mementos of her life rather than her disappearance. Life slowly resumed a new rhythm. Robert returned to woodworking, finally able to complete projects. Patricia found peace in tending Natalie's grave, planting flowers that bloomed each spring. Claire continued advocating for cold case victims, her sister's story fueling her passion for justice. The anonymous tipster who sent that March 2020 message was never identified. Investigators speculated it might have been someone Melissa had confided in, or perhaps someone who'd noticed inconsistencies in Ryan's story over the years. Whoever they were, they'd given the Hammond family the gift of closure. Bardstown slowly healed, but the case left permanent marks. Trust came harder now. The town that prided itself on community had learned that evil could hide behind familiar faces, but they'd also learned the power of persistence, of refusing to let cases go cold, of speaking up when something feels wrong. The Hammond family's story became a cautionary tale taught in police academies. How a cabin purchased through an LLC had slipped through investigative cracks. How phone records needed deeper analysis. How cases that seem solved can hide terrible truths. Natalie's death, tragic as it was, led to changes that might prevent similar oversights in future investigations, Ryan Caldwell serves his life sentence at Kentucky State Penitentiary, his appeals repeatedly denied. He's never shown remorse, never apologized, never explained why he chose murder over honesty. Some questions will never have answers. But one thing is certain, Natalie Grace Hammond is no longer missing. She's no longer a cold case file gathering dust. She's home, at rest, surrounded by family who never stopped searching, and a community that never stopped caring. And that, after 7 years of darkness, is everything. The story of Natalie Hammond reminds us that truth has a way of surfacing, even when buried deep. That justice, though delayed, can still arrive. And that the worst betrayals often come from those closest to us. If you found this case as compelling as we did, please hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Scenes for more true crime stories that need to be told. Share this video with anyone who appreciates deep dives into cases that shocked communities. What are your thoughts on this case? Should Melissa Tran have received a harsher sentence? How could the initial investigation have caught Ryan's secret cabin? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember that every cold case represents a family still waiting for answers.